May the 26th, 1940. Along roads lined with their smashed and abandoned equipment, British and French armies retreat to the only Channel port still open to them, Dunkirk. 10 miles away, along the Channel coast, German armor awaits Hitler's orders to attack. On the Dunkirk beaches, nearly 500,000 men, British and French, face surrender, or the slim chance of rescue by ships from England.
There were masses of troops, and they came down in a sort of a V shape to a crocodile semi-single file as they got near the water's edge. Of course, many of these soldiers were going out up to their necks in water and climbing into, say, minesweepers that could get in nearly as close as that. Others, of course, on the beach were embarking in the small boats, but there didn't seem to be any panic or worry at all. One came across lots of these small boats, many of them with perhaps even a dozen or so soldiers on board, heading back for England resolutely. One quite often offered to take their crews of soldiers off them so that they could go back for another load, and they said, no fear, we've got our 12 Pongos and we're going back to England with them. You go and get your own.
The beach was, well, you could say thousands of men being on Margate Beach on a bank holiday. The troops was in a pretty bad state. They were in a bad way. There was one man, especially I shall always remember. He came on board, he'd had his teeth blown out, and he was holding a rifle with a fixed bayonet. And we had to take all the arms away from him. We couldn't shift this gun out of this rifle out of this man's hands. His hands was actually gripped this, and they was fixture. Our chap was on a beach, and then he gets aboard a ship and he thinks he's safe. But they really did think this. They said, whoa, England home and beauty, let us get there, boy.
We were most impressed. They were very tired, and most of them just slumped down and went to sleep then.
Our job was to stop enemy aircraft getting at those troops. Because, believe me, if enemy aircraft had got superiority of the air at Dunkirk, they would have massacred those fellows on the beach. Nothing could have been done. They had no guns, they had no anti-aircraft. And German bombers and German dive bombers, the Stukas, would have just murdered them, and we couldn't have got those troops off. Another thing the Germans tried to do, of course, was to sink the ships. They knew that the fellows couldn't swim out to England. Therefore, they had to try and get on the ships, and if they could sink these ships, then the British Army would have been trapped.
The RAF tried to keep the German Air Force away from the beaches, but 6 destroyers and over 200 craft were sunk. Fighter Command lost nearly half its strength in the French campaign. 100 planes in the Dunkirk operations alone. Dunkirk was a major defeat, but the inspired efforts of the Royal Navy and the little ships saved 330,000 British and French troops. For a week, the weather was fine, and the German army was held off.
I really and truly don't think that they thought they'd ever get them off. That's my opinion. But it was an act of God that they did. The weather was good. The sea was like a mill pond. And this was a great help to everybody. If it'd been rough water, you'd have never got them all for Dunkirk. Because when those rollers go up that beach, they go.
At any moment, a breakthrough by the German army could have stopped the whole operation. I don't think, despite the valiant endeavors of the British and French troops who were keeping the Germans back, that they could have stopped the might of the German armor getting through if Hitler had so wanted to do it.
What was left of Dunkirk surrendered on June the 4th. Thousands of troops could not be rescued. A fortnight later, France stopped fighting, and the British Prime Minister Churchill broadcast to the world.
What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Britain prepared to face immediate invasion. A new evacuation of children began from the south and east coast areas where a German landing might be expected. Some parents sent their children overseas to safety. But this was stopped in September when a U-boat sank a British liner with 90 children on board. To guard against invasion, over 1 million men not required by the regular forces volunteered to form the Home Guard. They drilled with broomsticks because there were no rifles to spare, and rehearsed bloodthirsty defenses against a German attack. The regular army's training seems to have impressed the newsreels.
The one-time foot sloggers have turned Kickstarter pushers. Shanks's pony has given way to a spanking motorbike. The left-right blokes have got both feet off the ground at the same time. They're part of Britain's mighty mobile Mounties, all keen welcomers of Adolf when he drops in for a cup of tea and a cream bun. A battalion of infantry on wheels is at exercise, a swift-moving, striking force that would do the enemy a bit of no good. And they learn to take the rough with the smooth under conditions they might meet with on active service. Up and down they go, but unlike the Huns, they're always on the level.
The army had brought back their rifles from Dunkirk, but almost everything else had been abandoned in France. In June, the only fully equipped division in Britain was Canadian.
I remember in June going down to the southeast corner of Britain, where General Thorne was in command. That's to say, Kent, Surrey, Sussex, that sort of area. Certainly a possible landing area for the Germans if they were going to attempt it. And I remember sending a memorandum to Winston, which must be somewhere in his papers. If I remember right, I said something like this: the troops were in very good heart and that they very well trained and so forth. But, of course, there is no anti-tank weapon of any kind, no anti-tank gun, and no tanks. That was in the area where, if the Germans were going to land, they might very well be expected to land. That was the state of the cupboard. It was bare.
The king practiced marksmanship and rejoiced that Britain stood alone with no more allies to pamper. The head of fighter command, Sir Hugh Dowding, agreed. He had lost too many planes helping the French. Station names and signposts were removed to baffle invading Germans. The effect was to baffle British travelers. Anti-tank barriers made sure the Germans wouldn't have an easy passage if they advanced along the railways. In the invasion areas, the countryside disappeared under coils of barbed wire. The beaches, too, were wired to below low water mark. J.B. Priestley remembers a visit to the seaside.
I went down one hot summer day, late summer, to one of the seaside resorts, the Kent coast. The last time I visited it, packed out with beaches, absolutely crammed, and all the fun of the fair going on. Then to see it in this strange, bright, empty day, the beaches deserted, a lot of barbed wire all over the place, and I felt then that, in a way, this was a kind of symbol of what people felt, and that they were ready to abandon this for the time being in order to get on with the war.
Churchill was everywhere, no longer a suspect politician, but the living embodiment of the British will to resist. It was a situation he seemed to revel in, describing for colleagues a vivid picture of himself leading a last-man defense of a devastated Whitehall.
Immediately Churchill became Prime Minister, the pace in Whitehall changed. People started not merely to think fast, but to act fast. Distinguished civil servants could be seen running down the passages. Churchill himself was physically very energetic. He would suddenly make the most extraordinary and energetic sorties. He would inspect troops, marching at great speed down the ranks and outpacing all the younger men who were following him. I remember one evening he said that he must go and inspect some new works, and although he was 65 years old, he vaulted over a brick wall and landed feet first in a pool of liquid cement. And with an impertinence, which in retrospect I'm surprised at, I said to him, "Well, I think you've met your Waterloo," because he was stuck in the cement. And he turned to me and said, "How dare you? Anyhow, my Blenheim."
In the arms factories, men and women worked long hours to fill the gaps in British defenses. Production reached a peak in June, then fell as workers tired, but the spurt lasted through the critical time. Production of fighter planes doubled. 100 new Spitfires and Hurricanes a week replenished Dowding's forces. The new Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, took care to make ordinary people feel part of the production battle.
My father was a master of propaganda. There was the pots and pans, where everyone was asked to give up pots and pans and railings. And Stanley Baldwin didn't give up his gates, but most of the people gave up everything they could in the way of metal. The pilots, and we all knew that you couldn't make aircraft out of pots and pans, but it was good stuff. It brought the people to realize that it was a desperate situation. The response to the pots and pans was tremendous. They had piles and piles of pots and pans, not knowing what to do with them. But he, as I say, he was a great propagandist.
But where was the German invasion? In June 1940, Hitler had not begun to think about invading Britain. He was busy celebrating his French victory and expected Britain, like France, to make peace. Berlin gave him a hero's welcome when he returned there on July the 6th with Admiral Raeder and his other commanders-in-chief. Only the German Navy seemed to have plans for an invasion. By the time Hitler began to take an interest in them, the army had its own plans and was critical of the navies. Both looked to Goering, the Luftwaffe chief, to win control of the air, vital for an invasion. And Goering believed the Luftwaffe on its own could knock out Britain. Arguments between the services went on for months. The army at first wanted to land 40 divisions on a wide front between Ramsgate and Lyme Bay and press onto a line from Malden in Essex to the Severn estuaries, sealing off London. This was later scaled down to a landing by 9 divisions between Folkestone and Brighton, supported by 2 airborne divisions, about 200,000 men in all. By September, Britain had overcome her earlier weakness and had 16 divisions available in the southeast. An invasion fleet drawn from all parts of Germany was assembled in northern ports. Landing craft were built and boats converted to carry troops and amphibious tanks. The army thought the fleet too small. The navy thought even that size fleet difficult to protect. Both agreed that air supremacy is vital. The invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, was set for mid-September. The plans did not impress the Luftwaffe, on whom everything depended.
In my opinion, the plan was not serious. Especially the Navy didn't want to have the responsibility, and the Navy has asked the Air Force first of all to establish the absolute air superiority over the invasion area. And the preparations the Navy did were not very convincing. Also, our preparation, my wing especially, was destined to be one of the 2 wings to be transferred to England. And our preparations were about ridiculous. The Air Force was not trained and prepared to conduct an independent air war over England.
As the invasion fleet assembled, the Luftwaffe's first targets were merchant convoys and harbors, particularly in the narrow seas of the Channel. Dover became known as Hellfire Corner. There was always something for the newsreel camera or the news reporter, for instance, Charles Gardner of the BBC.
Well, now the Germans are dive bombing a convoy out into sea. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's one going down on his target now. Bomb. No, missed the ships. He hasn't hit a single ship. There are about 10 ships in the convoy, but he hasn't hit a single one. Because here they come. They come in absolute steep dive. You can see their bombs actually leave the machines and come into the water. You can hear our own guns going like anything now. There's a fight going on. You can hear the little rattles of machine gun bullets. That was a bomb, as you may imagine. There's another bomb dropping. Yes, it's dropped. Oh, it missed the convoy. No, they haven't hit the convoy in all this. What? What? Yes, oh, we just hit a Messerschmitt. Oh, that was beautiful. He's coming right down now. I think definitely that first got him. Absolute steep dive. Let's move round so I can watch him a bit more. Here he comes. And he's going slap into the sea, and there he goes. Smash! Oh boy, I've never seen anything so good as this. The RAF fighters have really got these boys dead.
The convoy system was disrupted and harbours like Dover were badly hit. But while the town suffered casualties, Dowding had not yet been forced to commit his full fighter strength.
The unique thing about Fighter Command was that when war broke out in September 1939, we had there a system covering the entire country for air defense. And that system was based on a radar, or as we used to call it in those days, RDF. And we had this chain of radar stations around the coast, and they were looking out up to 100 miles. And they were feeding on landlines all the information to the headquarters of Fighter Command.
Now, radar really won the Battle of Britain, because without it, we would have been doing standing patrols, and with a limited number of aircraft and a limited number of pilots, you couldn't have done it. As it was, we could wait on the ground, and then radar would watch, and through the various controls, we would be told to take off at a time when the Germans were massing over Calais or over Abbeville. And so therefore, we wasted no petrol, no time, no energy. In fact, we could sleep in between patrols, and then we'd take off and we would be directed towards the German formation given height, distance, and their numbers, which is very important.
On August the 13th, Goering changed his tactics. He ordered an attack against radar stations and fighter airfields which Fighter Command was bound to defend. While German bombers blitzed airfields that defended London and southeastern England, their escorting fighters would deal with the British fighters that came up to attack the bombers. Fighting over England put the Luftwaffe at a disadvantage. It was expected, but not equipped, to win a decisive battle alone. The German bombers were not designed to carry a heavy enough bomb load. The German fighters carried only enough fuel to stay over England for half an hour, whereas the British fighters, close to their bases, could land and refuel quickly enough to rejoin the battle.
Our range was very, very limited, and we could only cover a small part of the British islands, including London. But over London, as an example, we could only stay for 10 minutes to come back to our bases. So this limited range of our fighters in the escort has been perhaps the main point which avoided an effective air offensive against Britain.
Luftwaffe intelligence misled its pilots about the damage done to British airfields in the first assault. They claimed 8 had been virtually destroyed. In fact, none had been knocked out, and those damaged were quickly patched up again. The German pilots, faced by resistance they hadn't expected, became pessimistic about winning the battle.
We, fighting crews, were convinced that we couldn't win the battle, and we couldn't force England to surrender by attacking without any operation from the part of the army or the navy. Therefore, we were asking that the High Command should order the invasion, the sea line.
A mere 1,400 British fighter pilots and their ground crews stood between Britain and invasion. Their responsibility was great, too great perhaps to bear thinking about. The face they showed the world was dashing and carefree.
I think they took the situation not the least bit seriously from the point of view of their lives generally. Some fellows would just kick a ball around or lie around, some would sleep, read paperbacks, listen to the radio, and that was our life. I wanted to shoot an aeroplane down, but I didn't want to shoot a German down. I really did not. We did hear stories of Germans shooting our fellows in parachutes, and we used to think that was pretty horrible, but we weren't sure whether it was true or not. I know I had an experience of a German aircrew getting draped over my own wing. He bailed out of a bomber and got caught on my wing with his parachute. And I was jolly careful to get him off as easily and as quickly as I could by yawing the aeroplane and shaking him off.
I'd say there was no chivalry at all. I mean, between the German Air Force and the British, I'd say absolutely none. Not as far as I was concerned. I hated them. They were trying to do something to us. They were trying to enslave us.
The climax of the battle came at the end of August and in the first week in September. Upon the result depended Hitler's decision to launch his invasion. But the air battle itself was between a comparative handful of individuals on either side.
fights were rather extraordinary in a way, because although there were a lot of aircraft about, suddenly, when you were fighting a particular man, the sky became empty.
I don't think anyone ever considered that he would be killed. Death was something which was just put at the back of your mind. If it was not, then you'd have just got the jitters about it and been very worried. If a fellow did go missing, it was just poor old so-and-so, he's had it, and that was that. Inwardly, of course, you'd feel it tremendously if you lost a pal. But you didn't dwell on the subject of death at all.
Sometimes you could tell if a fellow was going to get killed, yes, you could. He sort of lost it, you know. My greatest friend was killed. He was shooting down, or shooting at a Messerschmitt, and there was another Messerschmitt hit him from behind, and that was all. I was shouting at him, and you couldn't do anything. And you saw him go in. That affected you, but you had to get on with it. Your friends affected you deeply. Terrible, but you couldn't help it.
In the last week of August and the first week of September, 103 of Fighter Command's pilots died. 128 were seriously wounded. 6 key airfields in the southeast were put out of action for days at a time. Against the fire of German fighters and bombers, Britain was now losing fighters even faster than Germany, nearly 500 in 2 weeks.
The last week in August, the first week in September, those 2 weeks were the worst for us, because by that last week in August, the Germans had been pounding the airfields mercilessly. And the 31st of August was probably our worst day. Fighter Command was very nearly on its knees, and Dowding was very conscious of that. And this was what was worrying him, this constant pounding of the airfields, and he was wondering how much longer he could hold out. When I say he, I mean Fighter Command, because he was still having to face that big problem of denying the Germans air superiority, and yet here they were knocking the airfields to pieces with the threat of knocking out Fighter Command. On the 6th of September, the King and Queen visited Fighter Command, and there were quite a few people who commented on how tired Dowding appeared to be. The day after, the 7th of September, when an invasion alert was issued, invasion imminent, and all that day things were remarkably quiet. And all of us were beginning to wonder what the devil was going to happen next. And then late afternoon, the Germans launched what many of the pilots who in the air having to face this onslaught found to be just about the heaviest attack they'd ever known. And then came what Dowding later described as the miracle. The attack didn't go to the airfields, it went to London, and the airfields were spared.
5 minutes to 5, the sirens went. I'm walking out onto the veranda, my veranda, looking down the river. The sky was full of planes. Within a couple of minutes, the bombs started dropping in the Millwall dock, and I could watch them. And that's how it went on for some considerable time.
On that first Saturday, they practically obliterated from the Silvertown Way to Silvertown. As a matter of fact, the whole of the Tidal Basin Custom House right up to Silvertown was obliterated. Make no mistake about it.
If it had continued that type of bombing in the daylight, we was hitting everything of consequence. Shipyards, gasworks, oil firms, everything of consequence. Nearly all the bombs are dropping in the proper target area.
That night, 250 bombers returned, the burning docks and warehouses an unmistakable marker. But Goering's change of tactics relieved the pressure. Fighter Command regrouped. London burned. After the raid on September the 7th, many rescue workers and firemen worked 40 hours non-stop. Most of us had the wind up to start with, one of them said, but you looked around and saw the rest doing their job. On September the 15th, the Luftwaffe mounted another major daylight attack, expecting no opposition. But this time, the Spitfires and Hurricanes were waiting for them. On that day, September the 15th, 56 German planes were shot down. Britain had retained command of the air by day. The Royal Air Force had won the Battle of Britain. September 1940. Now there were no more daylight raids, and there could be no invasion before the spring. But Britain's cities became targets for the night bombers. For 76 nights in succession, London was bombed. Queuing for shelter at dusk became an orderly ritual. The evening alert, the dawn all clear, part of Londoners' lives.
I used to hear the planes come over at night time, and they was, in my opinion, trying to break the backs of the houses. Yeah. I used to listen and shudder with the next one's mine. They'd have a stick of, say, 6 bombs. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is mine. No, over the next one they'd go. Miss my house. And that used to go on all night.
Well, about 10 to 8, I said to my wife and my in-laws, well, I'll be off now. And I just walked out the door, lovely big 3-floor houses they were. And I just walked up Approach Road about 20 yards from the church, which was our post. And so there was nothing. I heard nothing. And I've talked to people afterwards. And the bomb that hit them, they never heard. Now, I wonder if the people who are sitting here now had that same experience. The bomb that hit you, you never heard. And I fell flat on my face. I picked myself up, I turned around, all I could see was just a grey curtain hanging down the middle of a wide road, about twice as wide as this pub. There was just a brownish grey curtain hanging there.
no matter what shelter you went in, there was always someone there who would provide the entertainment to sort of take away the strain.
The underground stations, it was decided, must not be used as shelters, but people simply took them over, and the authorities had to accept the fact.
Well, we was all singing, we was all happy, just like there was no war at all. There was a canteen there, and I used to sing as well for the people and cheer all the people up when the bombs was going. Until one night it was very bad, and I was just under the seat and praying for the big guns to start.
I was talking to a gunnery sergeant who had actually been stationed in Hyde Park, and he told us without hesitation, and he cried when he told us. He said, believe me, he said, when we were sent into London, we simply elevated our guns to its maximum and fired. And we knew that every shell we was pumping up had no chance of hitting a plane. But he said, by God, he said, don't tell me it didn't give you courage. And there's not a person sitting around this table, I think, can say that it didn't. Once they heard those guns fire, they said, good, we've got them now. But they only knew that it was the morale. And that's all it did to them. But the bombs themselves, I mean, they just had to come down. There's nothing to stop them.
For 76 mornings, rescue squads dug through rubble searching for survivors.
A bomb dropped on a block of flats, about 4 stories, and it took the whole front out. And they said, there's an old chap up there, he won't go in the shelter. So we go up, and when we got up there, there's an old chap there snoring his head off, about 20 empty bottles round his bed, and the bed's nearly out in the street. And he never woke up then.
We saw this dear old lady sort of staggering around, and we said, come on, you'll have to come out. And she came out, and all she got on was just half of what should have been a night dress. And I said, no, you'll have to put something on, make yourself a bit decent. And she was about 80 odd, and she was completely in a daze. So she said, oh, I'll go in and get something. And she came out, she got her hat on.
People somehow got to work through a nightmare of upended buses, cratered roads, bombed railways.
London calling in the overseas service.
Radio reporters told America and the world that London could take it. The spirit of Londoners won sympathy and help, but the United States remained neutral. While Britain stood alone from September 1940 to May 1941, 40,000 people were killed in raids, half of them Londoners. Hundreds of thousands of people were homeless, eating, living, sleeping in rest centers. Clothing and everything else had vanished with their homes, but not morale.
To be clean, you couldn't very well say, well, I'm going to have a bath today, because you was afraid the warning would go halfway through it. So you'd have a bowl of water and have a wash and perhaps get your neck done and run and take all your things in the shelter. Finish your bath perhaps the next day. Never actually have a bath properly. Step in and step out.
You get used to it. You can get used to anything.
It was not an uncommon sight to see no windows, but plenty of spirit. Or, sorry, we've got no front door, don't trouble the knock, come straight in. And you see these funny little notices put up outside the door. You see, and this was the sort of thing that really made you think that there was something in it. And the more you saw it, the more you felt encouraged to be able to go out, and you knew that once you'd gone out to go on to a job, and your family were left behind, you always felt that somehow, all right, well, the Joneses or the Smiths up the road, if anything happens at home, they'll look after them.
Factories went on working by night as well as by day. But night workers were constantly interrupted by raids. There was no real defense against German bombing at night. Fighter Command's helplessness worried its chief, Dowding.
I once went down to Red Hill with him when bombers were coming over London, and that was a squadron down there, commanded by a fellow called Jimmy Little. And he said to me on the car going down, he said, "You know, Max, I hold my head in my hand at the horrible thought of all the little people being bombed, and I cannot do anything about it."
To the relief of the authorities, Buckingham Palace was bombed as well as East London. Now it could be seen that King, Queen, and people were all in it together. King George and Queen Elizabeth won respect by their tours of the blitzed areas. They had come to the throne in the shattering circumstance of the Duke of Windsor's abdication. Now, for the first time, they emerged as popular figures in their own right. Churchill, too, with bustling exuberance, persuaded most political opponents to forget his past.
The average East Londoner couldn't have cared tuppence for Winston Churchill as a man or politician, but the man who filled up Chamberlain's place, he was a leader. There's no doubt about it. He was a leader. And I think every time he opened his mouth, he inspired confidence into the people, whether they accepted him as a conservative, but he was there, he was for them, and he was against the common enemy.
But sometimes he got a mixed reception.
I can remember just off of Green Street, an avenue there where Churchill came down there, and there was a devil of a great crater as big as this pup. And there were crowds of women there trying to get out their bits and pieces out of the shattered houses. And Churchill, after having a look round, he said, "We can take it." And the women told him what they could take in no unmistakable manner, you believe me. And they said that we're the ones that are taking it, mister, you're out of the way.
December the 29th, 1940. German planes scattering incendiary bombs set the city of London ablaze. There were 1,500 fires in and around the city. St. Paul's Cathedral was surrounded by fire.
You could see the fire of London. You could see 60 miles away. You could see the fire.
That night when the fires were burning, I was in a shelter and it was burning above me. And we all had to get out, and we wasn't panicking a bit. And we had to run from the middle of the turning to the top of the commercial road in a factory. They had the shelter down below in the basement. And as we were running along, there was all fires, all burning all. I could feel the hot on the floor, the paddles were hot. And when we got into the shelter, we stood all night sleeping on each other's shoulders. I stood all night sleeping on somebody else's shoulder.
Eventually, we used so much water, we'd run out of it. And there we stood, letting the fires burn. And we couldn't do nothing about it.
The heart of the city of London was destroyed, but St. Paul's survived. Manchester, Coventry, Birmingham, Swansea, Liverpool, and many more shared London's ordeal. All were within reach of the German Air Force with bases in France and the Low Countries. It was more difficult for British bombers to reach German cities. The government looked anxiously round for some other way of carrying the war to the enemy.
We decided the only place where we could fight the enemy was the desert, North African desert, at the Middle East theatre generally. There was nowhere else. We couldn't hope to make a landing in France in any foreseeable future, and therefore couldn't injure the Germans that way. So the two alternatives, the two possibles, were bombing. They weren't alternatives. Two possibles were bombing and fighting in the Middle East. And that is why, from those very early days, we began to push, agitate, ask for more armor in the Middle East, and we had to take the armor out of the line here, as it were, out of the defense of Britain. There was no other way of doing it.
On December the 10th, 1940, 2 Commonwealth divisions of General Wavell's command attacked the big Italian army in North Africa. Slightly to their own surprise, they advanced with great speed. Fortress after fortress was taken. 100,000 prisoners were captured. Now there seemed to be a chance to get at the main enemy, Germany, through Yugoslavia and Greece.
We did think that if it were possible to bring certain Balkan countries into conflict with Hitler, that the consequences of that might be really unforeseeable. Couldn't tell what the result could be. The view of the War Cabinet and the Defense Committee at home was that we should, if the Greeks were going to defend themselves against the Germans, we should bring them what help we could. And Dill and I were sent out after Wavell's victories to Cairo to look into this business. Well, when we got there, Wavell said, "Now, I hope you won't mind what I'm going to say. I didn't think I ought to waste time, and I begun the movement of troops and the concentration to enable us to go to Greece."
The Commonwealth landing in Greece was meant to forestall a German attack. To many Greeks, it seemed likely to hasten it. They had held their own against the Italians, but when the Germans attacked on April the 6th, 1941, Greece was overwhelmed in 3 weeks. So was Yugoslavia, which had joined the Allies. 50,000 Commonwealth troops were evacuated.
One has to admit that we didn't obtain the objectives we'd hoped for. We weren't able to conduct, with the help of the Yugoslavs, any effective campaign in the Balkans. Turkey, it is true, remained a defensive pad. But we lost Greece and lost many men, brave men, and more were captured. So in that sense, the balance sheet was much against us. And it was at a pressing time, no question of that.
By May 1941, Germany and her allies controlled most of continental Europe. And in North Africa, a small German force under Rommel had recaptured nearly all the British gains. The British tried to hold Crete as a naval base. With complete command of the air, the Germans attacked Crete with 16,000 parachutists, the first large-scale airborne assault in the history of warfare. In spite of heavy losses, they gained a foothold on a vital airfield, Malimi, which meant that more troops could be flown in. Supported by intensive bombing, the Germans were able to advance against a bigger Commonwealth force. Once again, air power won the battle. Commonwealth losses, 13,000 killed, wounded or captured, and another evacuation to add to the list of Norway, France, Greece. The British people wondered how much more they would have to take.
Churchill thought it important that Crete should be held at all cost. If we lost Crete, we lost our base in the eastern Mediterranean, our naval base and our air base. And he kept on telegraphing to Wavell, saying, surely you can spare just a dozen tanks for the defense of Malimi airfield, which was the chief airfield in Crete, against German paratroops. And Wavell replied that he had no tanks, that they were all having their tracks mended or having their engines greased or something in the delta, and that he couldn't spare even a dozen. Well, Crete was lost, and it was a great disaster, upset everybody in the House of Commons, upset the country. It was a low point for us in the war in the spring of 1941.
I used to be up until 2:30 in the morning broadcasting to America and the Dominions and so on. And I'd snatch some pretty dicey sort of sleep in a basement in the broadcasting house, and then come out in the morning, and then I'd walk around, and I'd think, I don't think there can be very much more of this, because everything is going. On those mornings, you thought, well, another 2 weeks of this, and there'll be nothing round here but rubble.
On May the 10th, 1941, London suffered its most destructive night raid of the war. Over 3,000 people were killed or injured. Hundreds of fires had to be left to burn themselves out. There seemed no end in sight to the slaughter and destruction. But although Londoners didn't know, it was the turning point.
In April 41, Hitler assembled all the commanders in France, and during 2 hours he talked to us about the part 2 of the Battle of Britain. He told us later, 2 of us, namely Mölders, my friend Mölders and myself, that it has only been in order to camouflage the offensive against Russia. This has been in April 41. And the raid on the 10th of May can only be considered as a camouflage of the beginning Russian campaign.
Among the casualties of the raid on May the 10th was the House of Commons. For exactly a year of disappointment and defeat, the Commons had sustained Churchill in office. But the important battle had been won. Britain had survived. Now it was Russia's turn.